The chains meant for cattle would serve a different purpose that October night in 1851. Noah Carter's calloused hands wrapped around the iron links as his master Jonathan Pierce hung upside down from the barn rafters, swaying like butchered meat in the Georgia moonlight. The quiet field hand had finally snapped, but the question that haunted the plantation for years afterward wasn't how he did it. It was why Pierce never saw it coming from the man he trusted most. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Pierce plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of prime Georgia soil, its cotton fields rolling like white waves under the autumn sun. Jonathan Pierce walked these lands with the confidence of a man who believed God had ordained his dominion over everything he surveyed, from the rustling stalks to the bent backs working beneath them. At 34 years old, he had inherited more than just land from his father. He had inherited an unshakable faith in the natural order of things, a belief that some men were born to command, while others were destined to serve. Noah Carter moved through those same fields with a different kind of certainty, the quiet assurance of a man who knew every inch of soil he'd worked for 23 years. His hands, scarred by countless seasons of planting and harvesting, could read the earth like scripture. He knew when the cotton was ready by the sound it made in the wind, knew which patches would yield the best harvest by the color of the leaves at dawn. What Jonathan Pierce saw as his property, Noah understood as his prison, but a prison he had learned to navigate with the careful precision of a man whose survival depended on reading the moods and movements of his captors. The morning of October 15th began like any other, with the plantation bell clanging across the quarters at 4:30, calling the enslaved workers to another day of back-breaking labor. Noah pulled on his worn cotton shirt and stepped into the crisp autumn air, his breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, other figures emerged from their cabins, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to waste no motion, to conserve every ounce of energy for the long day ahead. Sarah walked beside him as they made their way to the fields, her presence a comfort that had sustained him through countless mornings like this one. She had been his wife for 7 years now, though their union existed only in their hearts and the recognition of their community, never in the eyes of the law that deemed them property rather than people. Her belly swelled with their second child, and Noah felt the familiar mixture of joy and terror that came with bringing new life into their world of bondage. "Baby's been kicking all night," Sarah whispered, her hand resting on her stomach as they walked. "Feels like this one's got your restless spirit." Noah smiled, despite the weight of the day ahead. "Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this one won't accept change so easily." The words hung between them, dangerous in their implication. Sarah's eyes met his, and in that look passed 1,000 conversations they could never speak aloud. Dreams of freedom that existed only in the space between heartbeats, in stolen moments when the weight of their circumstances lifted just enough to let hope breathe. Jonathan Pierce emerged from his grand house as the workers gathered in the fields, his polished boots clicking against the wooden steps of the wraparound porch. He carried himself with the bearing of Southern aristocracy, his shoulders straight and his chin lifted, as if perpetually posing for a portrait. His blond hair was perfectly combed despite the early hour, and his clothes bore the crisp lines of garments that had never known the touch of fieldwork. "Morning, Noah," Pierce called out, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who had never questioned his right to command. "I need you to check the north field today. Heard some of the hands saying the cotton there isn't picking clean." "Yes, sir, Master Pierce," Noah replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He had perfected the tone over the years, respectful but not servile, acknowledging Pierce's authority without surrendering his own dignity entirely. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance. Pierce nodded approvingly and moved on, stopping to speak with other workers, dispensing orders with the casual efficiency of a man managing livestock. Noah watched him go, studying the way Pierce moved through the world, noting the blind confidence that came with never having to consider another person's perspective, never having to wonder if the ground might shift beneath your feet. The sun climbed higher as the day progressed, beating down on the cotton fields with relentless intensity. Noah moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, his hands flying as he filled bag after bag with the white gold that made Jonathan Pierce wealthy and kept Noah in chains. The work was muscle memory now, allowing his mind to wander to places his body could never go. He thought of his son Marcus, now 5 years old, and already showing signs of the intelligence that both thrilled and terrified Noah. The boy asked questions constantly, his bright eyes taking in everything around him with the hungry curiosity of childhood. Just last week, Marcus had asked why some people lived in the big house while others lived in the small cabins, and Noah had struggled to find words that would satisfy his son's curiosity without planting dangerous gruff ideas in his young mind. Different folks got different jobs, Noah had said carefully, aware that Sarah was listening from across their small cabin. Some folks work the fields, some folks work in the house. But why can't we work in the house sometimes, and the house folks work in the fields sometimes? Marcus had pressed, his 5-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter with the brutal honesty of childhood. Noah had exchanged a look with Sarah, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. How do you explain to a child that the world is built on a lie? How do you teach them to navigate a system designed to break their spirit without breaking that spirit yourself? The memory was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the direction of the plantation house. Noah straightened, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun as he tried to make out what was happening. The group of men on horseback had arrived, their dust still settling in the courtyard. Even at this distance, Noah could see the tension in their posture, the way they sat their horses like men bringing bad news. Jonathan Pierce emerged from the house, his usual confident stride quickened by urgency. The men dismounted and gathered around him, their voices carrying across the fields in urgent whispers. Noah couldn't make out the words, but he could read the language of their bodies, the way they leaned in close, the quick gestures that spoke of crisis and conspiracy. One of the riders, a thin man with a scraggly beard, pulled a piece of paper from his coat and handed it to Pierce. Noah watched as his master's face changed, the casual authority melting into something harder, more dangerous. Pierce crumpled the paper in his fist and said something that made the other men nod grimly. The meeting broke up quickly, the riders mounting their horses and galloping away in a cloud of dust. Pierce stood alone in the courtyard for a long moment, staring after them, before turning his gaze toward the fields where his workers continued their labor, unaware of the storm brewing in their master's mind. That evening, as the sun set behind the pine trees that bordered the plantation, Noah made his way to the barn to tend to the livestock. It was a duty he had taken on years ago, one that gave him a few precious moments of solitude at the end of each day. The barn was his sanctuary, a place where he could think without the constant weight of watching eyes. The cattle lowed softly as he entered, their heads turning toward him with the lazy interest of well-fed animals. Noah moved among them with easy familiarity, checking their water, adding fresh hay to their feed troughs, performing the rituals of care that connected him to something larger than the brutal machinery of plantation life. It was here, in the golden light filtering through the barn's wooden slats, that Jonathan Pierce found him. "Noah!" Pierce's voice cut through the peaceful sounds of the animals, sharp with an edge that Noah had never heard before. "I need to speak with you." Noah straightened slowly, his hand still resting on the flank of the nearest cow. Something in Pierce's tone set his nerves on edge, a predatory quality that made every instinct scream danger. "Yes, sir, Master Pierce. What can I do for you?" Pierce stepped further into the barn, and Noah noticed for the first time that his master carried a coiled whip in his right hand, the leather gleaming dully in the fading light. The sight sent ice through Noah's veins, but he forced his face to remain neutral, his body language calm and unthreatening. "Had some visitors today," Pierce said, his voice conversational but with an undertone of steel. "Men from the county seat. Seems there's been some talk about runaway slaves, about people helping them get north. Underground Railroad, they call it." Noah nodded carefully, unsure where this conversation was heading, but certain that it nowhere good. "I heard tell of such things, Master Pierce. Terrible business, slaves running off like that." "Indeed it is," Pierce agreed, taking another step closer. "What's particularly interesting is that these men seem to think someone on my plantation might be involved. Someone who knows the local roads, who has the trust of the other slaves, who might be in a position to help coordinate such activities." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke, poisonous and choking. Noah felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. "Can't imagine who they might mean, Master Pierce. Most folks here are too busy with their work to be thinking about such things." Pierce smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Funny thing about trust, Noah. I've always thought you were one of the good ones. Reliable, hard-working, never caused me any trouble. But now I'm wondering if I've been too trusting, too generous in my assessment of your character." The whip uncoiled slightly in Pierce's hand, the leather making a soft whisper against his boot. Noah's eyes tracked the movement, his body tensing involuntarily. He had seen that whip used before, had watched other men and women scream beneath its bite. The memory of their cries echoed in his mind, mixing with the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. "Master Pierce," Noah said carefully, "I've served your family faithfully for 23 years. My daddy worked these fields before me, and his daddy before him. This is the only home I've ever known. And yet, Pierce said, taking another step closer, loyalty can be such a fragile thing. A man might serve faithfully for decades, all while harboring secret resentments, secret plans. The question is, Noah, have you been harboring secrets?" The barn suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around them. The cattle sensed the tension, shifting restlessly in their stalls, their large eyes reflecting the dying light. Noah's mind raced, considering his options, all of them terrible. He could deny everything, hope that Pierce had no real evidence, but the look in his master's eyes suggested that denial would only delay the inevitable. He could run, try to make it to the door before Pierce could stop him. But then what? Where could a black man run in Georgia that white men wouldn't find him? "I don't know what you've heard, Master Pierce," Noah said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I swear to you, I've never done anything to betray your trust." Pierce's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white in the gathering darkness. "Oh, Noah, you still don't understand, do you? It doesn't matter what you've actually done. What matters is what people think you might have done. What matters is that I can't afford to have any doubt about the loyalty of my property." The word property hit Noah like a physical blow, stripping away years of careful pretense, of the illusion that his faithful service had earned him some measure of respect or consideration. In that moment, he saw himself as Pierce, truly saw him, not as a man who had devoted his life to this land, but as a thing to be owned, controlled, disposed of at will. Pierce raised the whip, and Noah saw his death in the gesture. Not just his physical death, though that might come too, but the death of everything he had tried to build, everything he had hoped to protect. Sarah's face flashed through his mind, her hand on her swollen belly. And then Marcus, bright-eyed and curious, asking questions about justice that had no good answers. The whip cracked through the air, but Noah was already moving. 23 years of hard labor had made him strong, and desperation gave him speed. He lunged forward, inside the arc of the whip, his shoulder catching Pierce in the chest and driving them both back against the wooden wall of the barn. Pierce grunted, surprise and pain mingling in the sound as they crashed into the feed bins. The whip fell from his hand as he tried to regain his balance, but Noah was already on him, his calloused hands closing around Pierce's throat. 23 years, Noah whispered, his voice raw with emotion he had suppressed for decades. 23 years I've served you, and this is what it gets me? Accusations and threats? Pierce clawed at Noah's hands, his face reddening as he struggled to breathe. His eyes, wide with shock and growing fear, met Noah's, and for the first time in his life, Jonathan Pierce saw a slave not as property, but as a man with desires and grievances and the capacity for violence. "Please," Pierce gasped, the word barely audible. "Noah, please." But Noah's hands only tightened, years of suppressed rage flowing through his fingers like lightning. He thought of every morning he had awakened before dawn to serve another man's ambitions. Every evening he had collapsed exhausted while Pierce dined on fine food and slept in a soft bed. He thought of watching his son grow up in chains, of knowing that no amount of love or protection could shield Marcus from the world's casual cruelty. Pierce's struggles grew weaker, his face deepening from red to purple. His hands fell away from Noah's wrists, reaching blindly for something, anything that might save him. His fingers found the chain that hung from the barn's rafters, the heavy iron links that were used to hoist hay bales, and, occasionally, to slaughter cattle. The irony was not lost on Noah, as Pierce's hand closed around the chain. Here was the instrument of his own servitude, the symbol of everything that bound him to this place, this life of endless labor and degradation. And now, it would serve a different purpose. Noah released Pierce's throat and grabbed the chain, wrapping it around his master's wrists with the same practiced efficiency he had used to bind cattle for slaughter. Pierce gasped and coughed, trying to regain his breath, but Noah worked quickly, securing the bonds with knots he had learned over years of farm work. "What are you doing?" Pierce wheezed, his voice hoarse and frightened. "Noah, think about what you're doing. Think about your family." The mention of Sarah and Marcus sent a fresh wave of rage through Noah's system. "That's all I've been thinking about," he said, testing the knots to make sure they would hold. "Every day for 23 years. That's all I've thought about. How to keep them safe, how to make sure they had enough to eat, how to shield them from men like you." He walked to the pulley system that controlled the chain, the same mechanism he had used countless times to lift heavy loads. Pierce's eyes followed him, understanding dawning in their blue depths as he realized what Noah intended. "Noah, please," Pierce begged, all pretense of authority stripped away. "I have a family too. I have children. They need their father." Noah's hand paused on the pulley rope. For a moment, Pierce's words penetrated the red haze of his anger, reminding him that the man hanging before him was more than just a symbol of oppression. He was a human being, with people who loved him, people who would mourn his passing. But then Noah thought of all the families that had been torn apart by Pierce's casual cruelty, all the children who had been sold away from their parents to pay debts or satisfy whims. He thought of the woman named Julia who had tried to run last spring, and how Pierce had made an example of her, ordering her whipped in front of the entire plantation until her back was a ruin of torn flesh. "Your children will grow up free," Noah said quietly, his hand tightening on the rope. "They'll never know what it's like to belong to another person, to have their lives decided by someone else's whim. My children don't have that luxury." He pulled the rope, and Pierce rose into the air, his feet leaving the ground as the chain lifted him toward the barn's rafters. Pierce struggled against the bonds, his face contorting with fear and pain as the iron links cut into his wrists. "This is murder," Pierce gasped, his voice tight with panic. "This is cold-blooded murder, and they'll hang you for it." Noah continued pulling until Pierce hung upside down from the rafters, swaying gently in the evening air like a side of beef. The position would ensure that blood rushed to Pierce's head, making his death slower, more agonizing. It was the same way they slaughtered the cattle, a method designed to drain the blood completely from the carcass. "Maybe they will hang me," Noah said, securing the rope with practiced knots. "But at least I'll die knowing that for once in my life, I chose my own actions. For once, I wasn't dancing to another man's tune." Pierce's face was already beginning to redden from the blood cooling in his head. His struggles grew weaker as the position sapped his strength, but his eyes remained fixed on Noah with a mixture of hatred and pleading. "My family will hunt you down," Pierce whispered. "They'll track you to the ends of the earth. You'll never be safe." Noah walked to where Pierce had dropped the whip and picked it up, testing its weight in his hand. The leather felt different now, not the symbol of his oppression, but a tool of his liberation. "Maybe so," he said. "But Sarah and Marcus will be safer without me than they would be with me, once people start asking questions about what happened here." He raised the whip and brought it down across Pierce's exposed back, the crack echoing through the barn like thunder. Pierce screamed, the sound raw and primal, unlike anything Noah had ever heard from his master's lips. It was the sound of a man discovering that he was not, after all, immune to the cruelties he had inflicted on others. "That's for Julia," Noah said, raising the whip again. The second blow landed across Pierce's chest, and this time the scream was weaker, more breathless. Blood began to seep through Pierce's white shirt, staining the fabric crimson. "That's for every child sold away from their mother." The third blow opened a gash across Pierce's stomach, and Pierce's screams dissolved into whimpers. His struggles had stopped entirely now, his body hanging limp from the chain. "And this," Noah said, raising the whip one final time. "This is for every morning I woke up in chains." The final blow fell, and Pierce's whimpers ceased. His body swayed gently from the rafters, blood dripping steadily onto the barn floor below. Noah watched for several minutes, waiting to feel some sense of satisfaction or release, but there was only emptiness, a hollow space where his rage had been. He dropped the whip and walked to the barn door, looking out at the plantation grounds. Lights flickered in the windows of the slave quarters, families gathering for their evening meals, children being tucked into bed, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing despite the violence that had just occurred in the barn. Noah thought of Sarah, probably wondering where he was, why he was late returning from his duties. He thought of Marcus, perhaps asking for a bedtime story, his bright eyes full of trust and love. The knowledge that he would never see them again, never hold them again, cut deeper than any whip ever could. But there was no other choice. By morning, Pierce's body would be discovered, and the hunt would begin. Every slave on the plantation would be questioned, beaten, possibly killed in the search for the murderer. Noah could not allow his family to suffer for his actions, could not let them pay the price for his moment of rebellion. He walked back to Pierce's body and began the grisly work of staging the scene. Using his knife, he made additional cuts, deepening some wounds, creating others, trying to make it look like the work of multiple attackers. He scattered Pierce's belongings around the barn, overturned feed buckets, broke tools, creating the appearance of a struggle involving several people. When he was satisfied with his handiwork, Noah cleaned himself as best he could and slipped out of the barn. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds. Somewhere in those stars, his ancestors were watching, and Noah wondered what they thought of what he had done. He made his way to the slave quarters, moving silently between the cabins until he reached his own small home. Through the window, he could see Sarah moving about inside, her pregnancy making her movements careful and deliberate. Marcus sat at their small table, playing with carved wooden animals that Noah had made for him. Noah pressed his face to the glass, memorizing the scene, storing it away in his heart where no one could take it from him. Sarah looked up suddenly, as if sensing his presence, and their eyes met through the window. She smiled and gestured for him to come inside, but Noah shook his head slowly. He pressed his hand to the glass, and Sarah's expression changed, confusion giving way to concern as she read something in his face that she didn't understand, but that filled her with dread. She moved toward the window, but Noah was already turning away, disappearing into the shadows. He made his way to the edge of the plantation, where the pine forest began. Here he stopped and looked back one last time at the only home he had ever known. The barn was a dark silhouette against the stars, Pierce's body hanging inside like a grotesque scarecrow. The slave quarters were quiet now, their inhabitants settled for the night, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Noah turned his back on the Pierce plantation and walked into the forest. Behind him, the chains that had bound him for 23 years lay broken, but ahead lay only uncertainty, danger, and the slim hope of freedom. His feet found an old game trail that led north, toward a land he had heard about but never seen, where a man might walk upright and call himself by his own name. The pine needles muffled his footsteps as he walked through the night, guided by the North Star that had called to countless others before him. He thought of the Underground Railroad, the network of brave souls who risked everything to help people like him reach freedom. Maybe he would find them. Maybe they would help him reach the promised land of the northern states. Or maybe he would die in these woods, hunted down like an animal by Pierce's family and friends. Either way, he had chosen his own fate, had acted according to his own will rather than another man's command. That knowledge gave him strength as he walked deeper into the forest, leaving behind everything he had ever known in pursuit of something he had never dared to hope for. The stars wheeled overhead as Noah walked through the night, and with each step, the chains that had bound his spirit grew a little lighter, until finally they fell away entirely, leaving him free to walk his own path under the vast Asti, Georgia sky. Dawn came slowly to the Pierce plantation, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The plantation bell rang as always at 4:30, calling the enslaved workers to another day of labor. They emerged from their cabins, as they had for countless mornings before, unaware that this day would be unlike any other in the plantation's history. It was young Jacob who found the body. He had been sent to the barn to feed the cattle, a simple task that should have taken only a few minutes. His scream echoed across the plantation grounds, a sound so filled with horror and shock that it brought people running from all directions. By the time the crowd gathered, Jacob was on his knees outside the barn, vomiting into the red Georgia clay. He pointed a shaking finger toward the barn door, unable to form words to describe what he had seen inside. The plantation's overseer, a hard man named Briggs, pushed through the crowd and stepped into the barn. His own exclamation of shock confirmed what Jacob's reaction had already suggested, that something terrible had happened in the night. "Get everyone back," Briggs shouted, emerging from the barn with his face pale and drawn. "Nobody else goes in there until the sheriff arrives." But curiosity and morbid fascination are powerful forces, and despite Briggs's orders, whispers began to spread through the crowd. Those who managed to glimpse inside the barn before being forced back spoke of blood on the floor, of chains hanging from the rafters, of their master's body displayed like butchered meat. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her hand pressed to her swollen belly, her eyes searching for Noah among the faces around her. She had awakened before dawn to find his side of their bed empty and cold, and a sick feeling had been growing in her stomach ever since. Now, seeing the horror on the faces of those who had looked inside the barn, that feeling crystallized into certainty. The sheriff arrived within 2 hours, a fat man named Williamson, who rode up in a cloud of dust with 3 deputies behind him. They spent a long time in the barn, examining the scene, asking questions in low voices. When they finally emerged, Williamson's face was grim with the knowledge of what this meant for everyone on the plantation. "I want every slave accounted for," he announced to the crowd that had gathered. "Every man, woman, and child. Nobody leaves these grounds until we figure out what happened here." The next few hours were a nightmare of questioning and accusations. The enslaved workers were lined up and interrogated one by one, their quarters searched, their possessions examined for any evidence that might connect them to Pierce's murder. Some were beaten when their answers didn't satisfy the investigators, others when they seemed too nervous or too calm. Sarah endured her questioning with the stoic dignity of a woman who had learned to survive by revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. When Williamson asked about Noah's whereabouts, she looked him straight in the eye and said she assumed he was working in the fields, as he did every day. "When did you last see your husband?" Williamson pressed, his small eyes studying her face for any sign of deception. "Last night at supper," Sarah replied, which was technically true. She had seen Noah through the window of their cabin, had watched him turn away and disappear into the shadows, but she had not spoken with him, had not been told where he was going or why. Young Marcus was questioned too, despite his age. The child sat on his mother's lap, his bright eyes wide with confusion as grown men asked him questions he didn't understand about his father's activities. When Marcus asked why Papa wasn't there to answer the questions himself, Sarah held him tighter and told him that Papa had to work in a different field today. By afternoon, it became clear that Noah Carter had vanished without a trace. His tools were still in their assigned places, his few personal possessions still in his cabin. But the man himself had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. The tracking dogs brought in from the county seat picked up his scent leading toward the pine forest, but lost it at a creek that ran through the woods. The search continued for days, expanding outward from the plantation in widening circles. Patrols of armed white men combed the countryside, searching every barn and cabin, questioning anyone who might have seen a runaway slave. Rewards were posted in neighboring counties, describing Noah Carter as a dangerous murderer who should be shot on sight. But Noah had vanished into the vast network of people and places that comprised the Underground Railroad, that shadowy organization that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Whether he reached the North or died trying, whether he lived to old age under a new name or was captured and killed along the way, became one of the mysteries that the plantation's remaining inhabitants would discuss in whispers for Sforel. Years to come. Sarah gave birth to her daughter 3 months later, during a cold snap in January that froze the water in the wash basins and made the cabin walls creak with frost. She named the baby Hope, a choice that raised eyebrows among both the enslaved community and the plantation's new owner, Pierce's brother who had inherited the property. Marcus grew up with the story of his father's disappearance woven into the fabric of his childhood. A tale that changed slightly with each telling but always ended with Noah walking away into the darkness, choosing freedom over safety, rebellion over submission. To the boy, his father became a figure of legend, a man who had refused to accept the chains that others took for granted. The new master, Robert Pierce, ruled the plantation with an iron fist, determined not to repeat his brother's mistake of trusting his property too much. The workdays grew longer, the punishments harsher, the atmosphere more oppressive. But sometimes, when the work was particularly backbreaking, or the overseer's whip fell with unusual cruelty, the enslaved workers would whisper among themselves about Noah Carter, the quiet field hand who had finally said, "No." Years passed, and the story took on the mythic qualities that such tales acquire with time and retelling. Some said Noah had made it to Canada, where he worked as a free man and sent secret messages back to his family. Others claimed he had joined the Union Army when the war finally came, fighting to liberate those he had left behind. Still others insisted he had never left Georgia at all, but lived as a fugitive in the deep woods, helping other runaway slaves find their way to freedom. The truth, like Noah himself, had disappeared into the shadows of history, leaving behind only the story of one man's refusal to accept the unacceptable. One moment when the oppressed became the oppressor, when the property claimed ownership of his own fate. In the barn where Jonathan Pierce had died, the bloodstains eventually faded, and the chains were replaced. But the enslaved workers, who tended the cattle there, would sometimes pause in their work, listening to the wind in the rafters, and remembering the night when everything changed. They would think of Noah Carter, walking north under the stars, and wonder if somewhere in the vast world beyond the plantation's boundaries, a free man was telling his children about the home he had left behind and the price he had paid for his liberty. The Pierce plantation continued to operate until 1865, when Union troops arrived to inform its inhabitants that slavery had been abolished and they were free to go where they pleased. Sarah, now a woman in her 40s, gathered her children and prepared to leave the only home they had ever known. As they walked down the dusty road that led away from the plantation, Marcus looked back one last time at the barn where his father had made his stand. "Do you think Papa ever made it north?" he asked his mother, his voice quiet with the weight of years of wondering. Sarah smiled and took her son's hand, her daughter walking beside them with her own children, the next generation born into a world where the chains of slavery were finally broken. "I think your Papa found exactly what he was looking for," she said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "He found a way to be free." The story of Noah Carter became part of the oral tradition that enslaved families passed down through generations, a reminder that even in the darkest times, human dignity could not be completely extinguished. It was a story about the price of freedom, about the moment when endurance becomes resistance, when a man decides that death with dignity is preferable to life without it. In the years that followed, as the country struggled to rebuild itself after the Civil War, Noah's story was told and retold in churches and schools, in family gatherings and community meetings. Each telling added new details, new interpretations, new meanings, until the quiet field hand who had disappeared into the Georgia woods became a symbol of something larger than himself. To some, he was a hero who had struck a blow for justice in an unjust world. To others, he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing oppressed people too far. To his family, he remained simply a husband and father who had loved them enough to sacrifice everything for the possibility of a better world. The barn on the Pierce plantation stood for many years after the war, weathering storms and seasons until finally the roof collapsed and the walls fell in on themselves. But the story lived on, passed from parent to child, from teacher to student, from preacher to congregation, a testament to the power of one person to change the world, even if that change comes at the ultimate cost. In the end, Noah Carter's legacy was not the violence he had done, but the freedom he had claimed, not the life he had taken, but the life he had chosen to live on his own terms. He had walked into the darkness of the Georgia woods and emerged as something new, something that could not be owned or controlled or contained within the narrow boundaries of another man's definition. Whether he lived to see the end of slavery, whether he died a free man or a fugitive, whether his bones rested in some unmarked grave or in the soil of a northern cemetery, mattered less than the fact that he had chosen his own fate, had written his own ending to a story that others had tried to tell for him. The chains that had bound him to the Pierce plantation had been made of more than iron. They had been forged from law and custom, from the accumulated weight of centuries of injustice, from the belief that some people were born to serve while others were born to command. But on that October night in 1851, Noah Carter had broken those chains with his own hands, had proven that no system of oppression is stronger than the human spirit's desire for freedom. His story became a reminder that history is not made only by the famous and the powerful, but also by ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and choose to act with courage rather than submit with resignation. It was a story about the moment when the impossible becomes inevitable, when change comes not through gradual reform, but through sudden, irreversible action. The pine forests of Georgia still whisper with the wind, and sometimes, on nights when the stars are bright and the air is clear, it's possible to imagine a figure walking through those woods, heading north toward a freedom that exists not just as a place, but as a state of mind, a condition of the soul. Noah Carter had found that freedom in the most unlikely place, in the moment when he chose to fight rather than submit, to act rather than endure. His story lived on because it spoke to something universal in the human experience, the desire to control one's own destiny, to live according to one's own values rather than someone else's expectations. It was a story about the price of dignity and the cost of justice, about what happens when ordinary people are pushed beyond the limits of endurance. In churches across the South, preachers would tell the story of Noah Carter as an example of how the meek could inherit the earth, how the last could become first, how even the most powerless could find a way to assert their humanity. In schools, teachers would use his tale to illustrate the complex moral questions that arose from slavery, the way that an unjust system could corrupt both oppressor and oppressed, creating situations where violence became the only language that could be understood. The story evolved with each generation, taking on new meanings as the country itself changed. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Noah Carter's name was invoked by activists who saw in his actions a precedent for resistance against racial oppression. His willingness to risk everything for freedom resonated with people who were facing their own struggles for dignity and equality, who understood that sometimes progress requires more than patience and prayer. But the story also carried warnings about the cost of violence, the way that taking a life, even in the cause of justice, leaves scars on the soul that never fully heal. Those who told Noah's story were careful to emphasize that his actions arose from desperation rather than calculation, that he was a man pushed beyond the breaking point rather than a cold-blooded killer who set out to murder his master. The complexity of Noah's character, the way he could be both victim and perpetrator, both hero and cautionary tale, gave his story a depth that simple morality tales often lack. He was not a perfect man or a saint, but a human being struggling to maintain his humanity in an inhumane system, trying to protect his family while preserving his own dignity. As the decades passed and the immediate pain of slavery began to fade into historical memory, Noah Carter's story took on an almost mythical quality. He became a figure like John Henry or Paul Bunyan, larger than life but rooted in the real experiences of real people. Children would hear his story and dream of their own moments of defiance, their own chances to stand up against injustice and claim their freedom. The barn on the Pierce plantation became a pilgrimage site for some, a place where people would come to remember not just Noah Carter, but all the enslaved people who had suffered and died in bondage. They would stand in the ruins and imagine that October night in 1851, when the natural order of things had been turned upside down, when the slave had become the master of his own fate. Historians would debate the details of Noah's story, questioning which parts were fact and which were legend, but the power of the tale lay not in its historical accuracy, but in its emotional truth. It captured something essential about the American experience, the tension between the ideals of freedom and equality and the reality of oppression and injustice. The story also became a reminder that freedom is not a gift that can be given or taken away by others. but a condition that must be claimed and defended by each individual. Noah Carter had not waited for someone else to grant him liberty. He had seized it with his own hands, accepting the terrible consequences that came with that choice. In the final analysis, Noah Carter's legacy was not the violence he had committed, but the courage he had shown, not the life he had taken, but the life he had chosen to live. He had proven that, even in the most desperate circumstances, human beings retain the capacity to choose their own path, to write their own story, to claim their own freedom regardless of the cost. The wind still blows through the pine forests of Georgia, carrying with it the whispered stories of those who walked those paths before us. Somewhere in that wind, perhaps, is the spirit of Noah Carter, still walking north toward a freedom that exists not just as a destination, but as a way of being, a refusal to accept the limitations that others would place upon the human spirit. His story reminds us that history is not just about the great movements and famous leaders, but about the individual moments when ordinary people choose to act with extraordinary courage. It is about the field hand who decides he will no longer bow his head, the mother who teaches her children to dream of freedom, the father who sacrifices everything so that his children might live in a better world. Noah Carter walked into the darkness of that October night and emerged as something new, something that could not be contained within the narrow definitions of his time. He became a symbol of the unquenchable human desire for freedom, a reminder that no system of oppression can completely destroy the human spirit. The chains that bound him were made of iron, but they were also made of law and custom, of the accumulated weight of centuries of injustice. When he broke those chains, he did more than free himself. He cracked the foundation of the entire system, proving that what seemed permanent and unchangeable was actually fragile and temporary. His story lives on because it speaks to something universal in the human experience, the desire to control one's own destiny, to live according to one's own values, rather than someone else's expectations. It is a story about the moment when endurance becomes resistance, when survival becomes defiance, when a man decides that he would rather die on his feet than live on his knees. In the end, Noah Carter's greatest victory was not the death of Jonathan Pierce, but the birth of his own freedom. He had walked away from the plantation not just as a fugitive, but as a free man, carrying with him the knowledge that he had chosen his own fate, written his own story, claimed his own place in the world. The stars that guided him north on that long-ago night still shine in the Georgia sky, still call to those who dream of freedom and are willing to pay its price. They are a reminder that liberty is not a destination, but a journey, not a gift, but a choice, not an ending, but a beginning. Noah Carter's story began in the cotton fields of Georgia, but it has no ending, because the struggle for human dignity and freedom continues in every generation. In every place where people refuse to accept that things must remain as they have always been. His legacy is the knowledge that change is possible, that justice can triumph, that even the most powerless can find a way to claim their freedom. The plantation bell that once summoned enslaved workers to their labor is silent now, but the story of Noah Carter rings on, a testament to the power of one person to change the world, to the courage required to break the chains of injustice, and to the eternal human hunger for freedom that no force on earth can ultimately suppress. He was a field hand who became a legend, a slave who claimed his liberty, a man who proved that the human spirit cannot be owned, cannot be broken, cannot be contained within the narrow boundaries of another's soft definition. His story is America's story, a tale of struggle and sacrifice, of courage and consequence, of the long journey from bondage to freedom that defines our national character. In the ruins of the old barn, where the bloodstains have long since faded and the chains have rusted away, visitors sometimes claim they can still feel Noah's presence, still sense the power of that moment when everything changed. They stand in the silence and remember that freedom is not free, that justice comes at a cost, that the price of liberty is often paid in blood and sacrifice. Noah Carter's story reminds us that we are all capable of heroism, all capable of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. It calls us to examine our own lives, our own circumstances, our own willingness to fight for what we believe in, to sacrifice for what we love, to claim our own freedom regardless of the cost. The wind carries his story across the years, across the miles, across the boundaries that divide us, whispering to each new generation that freedom is possible, that justice can prevail, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they find the courage to act according to their deepest convictions. Noah Carter walked into history on that October night in 1851, but he walked out of it as something more than a man, something more than a slave, something more than a victim. He became a symbol of the unconquerable human spirit, a reminder that no chain is stronger than the will to be free, no system more powerful than the individual courage to say no to injustice. His story ends where all the best stories end, not with answers but with inspiration, not with conclusions but with possibilities, not with an ending but with the promise of new beginnings. Somewhere in the darkness of the Georgia woods, Noah Carter is still walking north, still moving toward a freedom that exists not just as a place, but as a condition of the soul, still proving that the human spirit cannot be owned, cannot be broken, cannot be contained. The story of Noah Carter, the quiet field hand who hung his master from the barn rafters like a slaughtered hog, became more than history. It became hope, more than memory. It became inspiration, more than a tale of one man's courage. It became a promise that freedom is possible for all who have the courage to claim it. But Noah's journey through the Georgia wilderness was far from over when he disappeared into the pine forest that October night. The path to freedom was treacherous, filled with dangers that tested not just his physical endurance, but his mental resilience and spiritual strength. Every step he took away from the Pierce plantation was a step deeper into uncertainty, where the wrong turn could mean capture, torture, and death. The first 3 days were the most dangerous. Noah knew that search parties would be combing the countryside, that bloodhounds would be tracking his scent, that every white face he encountered could spell his doom. He traveled only at night, using the North Star as his compass, hiding during the day in dense thickets or abandoned buildings, surviving on creek water and whatever berries or edible roots he could find. His knowledge of the land served him well. 23 years of working the fields had taught him to read the landscape like a book, to understand the patterns of streams and ridges, to know which plants were safe to eat and which would bring sickness or death. The skills that had made him valuable as a slave now became the tools of his liberation. On the third night, as he crept through a swampy bottomland where the search dogs couldn't follow his scent, Noah encountered his first test of faith. Exhausted, hungry, and beginning to doubt whether he would ever see Sarah and Marcus again, he stopped beside a moonlit creek and allowed despair to wash over him like the cold water at his feet. The weight of what he had done, the finality of his choice, hit him with crushing force. He had murdered a man, not in the heat of passion but with cold deliberation, stringing him up like an animal and watching him die. The image of Jonathan Pierce's face, purple and distorted in the barn shadows, haunted Noah's dreams and followed him through his waking hours. But as he knelt by the creek, his reflection wavering in the dark water, Noah remembered Julia's screams as Pierce's whip tore her flesh. He remembered the sound of children crying as they were sold away from their mothers. He remembered 23 years of humiliation and degradation, of watching his people treated like livestock while their masters lived in luxury built on stolen labor. The doubt passed, replaced by a hard certainty that what he had done was justice, even if the law would never see it that way. Pierce had been a man who profited from human misery, who built his wealth on the backs of people he refused to acknowledge as fully human. His death was not murder but execution, the settling of a debt that had been accumulating for generations. Noah rose from beside the creek and continued north, his resolve strengthened by the knowledge that he had acted not from cruelty, but from necessity, not from hatred, but from love for his family and his people. Each step carried him farther from the world he had known and closer to a future he could barely imagine. The Underground Railroad found him on his 7th night of freedom, or perhaps he found it, as the mysterious network of safe houses and secret passages seemed to operate according to its own invisible logic. Noah had been following a dim trail through dense forest when he noticed a light flickering through the trees, warm and welcoming in the cold October darkness. His first instinct was to flee, but something about the quality of the light, the way it seemed to beckon rather than threaten, made him pause. As he crept closer, he saw a small cabin nestled in a clearing, smoke rising from its chimney, a single candle burning in the window. On the porch sat an elderly white man, rocking slowly in a chair, as if he had been waiting for someone to emerge from the woods. "Evening, friend," the man said softly when Noah stepped into the clearing. "You look like a man who's traveled a long way." Noah's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, but something in the stranger's voice, a gentleness that he had rarely heard from white lips, made him pause. Reckon I have," he replied carefully. The old man smiled, his weathered face crinkling with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Name's Benjamin Hartwell. My friends call me Ben. And you, I suspect, are someone who could use a hot meal and a safe place to rest." Noah studied Ben's face in the candlelight, searching for signs of deception or trap, but the old man's eyes held only kindness and a deep sadness, as if he had seen too much of the world's cruelty and had chosen to spend his remaining years trying to balance the scales of justice. "How do I know you're not fixin' to turn me in for the reward?" Noah asked, his voice barely above a whisper, then chuckled softly. "Because, son, I've been helping people like you find their way north for 15 years. The only reward I'm interested in is the one I'll get from the Lord above when I stand before Him and account for how I spent my time on this earth." The old man rose from his rocking chair and gestured toward the cabin door. "You hungry? My Sarah, God rest her soul, always said a man can't think clearly on an empty stomach." The mention of the name Sarah sent a pang through Noah's heart, but he followed Ben into the warm cabin. The interior was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace crackling merrily and the smell of cornbread and beans filling the air. For the first time in a week, Noah allowed himself to relax slightly, though his hand never strayed far from his knife. Ben ladled food onto a wooden plate and set it before Noah, who ate with the desperate hunger of a man who had been surviving on berries and stream water. As he ate, Ben talked quietly about the network of people who helped runaway slaves reach freedom, painting a picture of ordinary citizens who had decided that some laws were worth breaking. "We call it the Underground Railroad, though it ain't underground and it sure ain't a railroad," Ben explained, refilling Noah's plate. "It's just folks who believe that all men are created equal, regardless of what the law says about property and such." Noah looked up from his food, studying Ben's lined face. "Why do you do it? Risk your life for strangers?" Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Had a friend once, back in Virginia. Good man, worked harder than anyone I knew. But he was born with dark skin, and that made him property in the eyes of the law. Watched him get beaten to death by an overseer who thought he was moving too slow." The old man's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Couldn't save my friend, but I figured maybe I could save others. Been doing it ever since, moving folks north to places where they can live as free people." Noah finished his meal in thoughtful silence, processing the idea that there were white people willing to risk everything to help enslaved people escape. It challenged everything he had been taught about the natural order of things, the assumption that all white people were enemies, or at best indifferent to the suffering of those in bondage. "What's the next step?" Noah asked finally. Ben smiled and rose from the table. "Next step is getting you some proper clothes and papers that'll help you pass as a free man. Can't have you wandering around in field clothes if you want to make it to the Ohio River." The old man disappeared into a back room and returned with a bundle of clothing. Work pants and a shirt that had seen better days but were cleaner and more respectable than what Noah wore. There was also a hat, worn but serviceable, and a small leather pouch containing official-looking papers. "Name on those papers is William Johnson," Ben explained. "You're a free colored man from South Carolina, heading north to find work. Story is, you've got family in Cincinnati who can help you get established." Noah examined the papers, marveling at the careful forgery. The documents looked official enough to fool a casual inspection, complete with seals and signatures that appeared genuine. The name William Johnson felt strange on his tongue when he practiced saying it, but he understood that Noah Carter had to disappear if William Johnson was to survive. "How long before I reach the Ohio River?" he asked. "If all goes well, maybe 2 weeks," Ben replied. "You'll move from station to station, safe house to safe house. Each person will know only the next step in the journey, so if anyone gets caught, they can't betray the whole network." That night, Noah slept in a real bed for the first time since leaving the plantation. The mattress was straw-filled but comfortable, and the blankets were warm and clean. Yet sleep brought dreams of Sarah and Marcus, images of his family that filled him with both longing and guilt. He had abandoned them to save them, left them behind to protect them from the consequences of his actions, but the pain of separation was almost unbearable. In his dreams, he saw Sarah's face at the cabin window, confusion and fear in her eyes as she realized he was leaving. He saw Marcus playing with his wooden animals, innocently asking when Papa would come home. The knowledge that he might never see them again, never hold his son, or watch his daughter take her first steps, was a constant ache in his chest. Morning brought new challenges. Ben explained the rules of traveling on the Underground Railroad, the coded signals and secret passwords that would identify him to conductors and station masters along the way. A quilt hung on a CS clothesline in a particular pattern might indicate a safe house. A certain phrase spoken to a stranger could reveal whether they were friend or foe. Most important thing, Ben emphasized, is to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if a situation seems dangerous, don't hesitate to run. Better to spend a night in the woods than the rest of your life in chains, or worse. Noah nodded, understanding that his survival depended not just on the kindness of strangers, but on his own ability to read people and situations, to sense danger before it revealed itself fully. The skills he had developed as a slave, the ability to anticipate a master's mood or an overseer's temper, would serve him well on the journey north. Before leaving Ben's cabin, Noah wrote a letter to Sarah, pouring his heart onto paper in the careful script he had secretly taught himself over the years. He told her about his love for her and Marcus, about his dreams for their unborn daughter, about his hope that someday they might be reunited in freedom. Ben promised to find a way to get the letter to her, though he warned that it might take months or even years. The second leg of Noah's journey took him through the mountains of northern Georgia, where the Underground Railroad operated through a network of caves and hidden trails known only to a few trusted guides. His conductor for this stretch was a free black man named Joshua, who had made the journey to freedom himself years earlier and now returned regularly to help others follow the same path. Joshua was younger than Noah, perhaps 25, but he moved through the mountains with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and ravine. He spoke little during their 3 days together, communicating mostly through gestures and whispered warnings about dangers ahead. "Slave catcher's been through here recently," Joshua explained as they sheltered in a cave during a rainstorm. "Found one of our safe houses last week, arrested the family that was hiding runaways. Got to be extra careful now." The news sent a chill through Noah's heart. The Underground Railroad was not infallible, and the people who risked their lives to help fugitive slaves were vulnerable to betrayal, bad luck, and the relentless pursuit of those who profited from human bondage. Every person who helped him was taking an enormous risk, potentially sacrificing their own freedom or even their lives for his sake. "Why do you do it?" Noah asked, echoing the question he had posed to Ben. "You made it out. You're free. Why come back?" Joshua was quiet for a long time, staring out at the rain falling across the mountain valley. "Got a sister still in chains down in Alabama," he said finally. "Maybe she'll never make it out. Maybe she's too scared to try. But maybe someday she will. And when that day comes, I want to make sure there's a road for her to travel." The simple honesty of the answer struck Noah deeply. Joshua wasn't helping strangers out of abstract principles or religious duty, but out of love for someone he had left behind, someone who might never benefit from his sacrifice, but whose potential freedom gave meaning to his dangerous work. Noah thought of Marcus and the daughter he would never see, wondered if someday they might follow the same path he was traveling, might benefit from the network of brave souls who risk everything to help others claim their freedom. The thought gave him strength to continue when exhaustion and despair threatened to overwhelm him. The mountain crossing was treacherous, with narrow paths that skirted deep ravines and hidden dangers that could trap the unwary. But it was also beautiful in a way that took Noah's breath away. Having spent his entire life in the flat cotton country of Central Baja, Georgia, he had never seen mountains before, never experienced the way they seemed to touch the sky, or the sense of vast space that opened up from their peaks. On their second night in the mountains, as they camped in another hidden cave, Joshua shared stories of other fugitives he had guided to freedom. There was Rachel, a house slave who had escaped after watching her daughter sold to a plantation in Mississippi. There was Daniel, a blacksmith who had used his skills to forge papers for other runaways before making his own escape. There was Mary, barely 16, who had run after her master decided she was old enough for his personal attention. Each story was different, but they all shared common elements: the moment when endurance became unbearable, when the risk of death seemed preferable to another day in bondage, when hope overcame fear and desperation transformed into determination. Noah began to understand that he was part of something larger than his own quest for freedom, part of a movement that challenged the very foundations of Southern society. "How many make it?" Noah asked as they prepared to sleep. Joshua's face was grim in the firelight. "Maybe half," he said honestly. "Some get caught, some turn back, some just disappear into the wilderness, and we never know what happened to them. But the ones who make it, they make it count. They build new lives, raise free children, show the world that we're more than what the slaveholders say we are." The third day brought them to the Tennessee border, where Noah was handed off to another conductor, a white woman named Elizabeth who operated a way station disguised as a boarding house for traveling merchants. Elizabeth was middle-aged and matronly, with steel-gray hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. "You'll be William Johnson, the free colored man from South Carolina," she reminded him as they walked toward her establishment. "You're traveling to Cincinnati to work in a furniture factory owned by your cousin. If anyone asks detailed questions, you've never been to Cincinnati before, so you don't know much about it, except what your cousin has told you in letters." The boarding house was a revelation to Noah, who had never stayed in such a place, or even imagined what it would be like. There were real beds with clean sheets, hot meals served on china plates, and other travelers who treated him with the distant politeness accorded to any paying customer. For the first time since leaving the plantation, Noah experienced what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than property. But the illusion was fragile, dependent on his papers and his ability to play the role convincingly. At dinner, he found himself seated next to a cotton merchant from Alabama, who spoke casually about the prices being paid for field hands and the difficulties of managing large numbers of enslaved workers. "Of course, the secret is keeping them scared but not desperate," the merchant explained, cutting into his roast beef with obvious satisfaction. "Too much kindness, and they get uppity ideas. Too much cruelty, and they might do something foolish, like that business down in Georgia last month." Noah's blood ran cold, but he forced himself to show polite interest. "What business was that?" The merchant leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Slave murdered his master, strung him up in the barn like a side of beef. Man named Pierce owned a big cotton operation. They're still looking for the killer, offering a $1,000 reward." $1,000. The sum was staggering, more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Noah realized that every white person he encountered was a potential bounty hunter, that his description was probably posted in every sheriff's office and newspaper, from Georgia to Ohio. "Terrible business," Noah managed, his voice steady despite the fear racing through his veins. "Indeed it is," the merchant agreed. "But it shows what happens when you give slaves too much freedom, too much trust. That Pierce fellow was known for being soft on his property. Should have kept them in line with a firm hand." Noah excused himself soon after, claiming fatigue from his journey. In the privacy of his small room, he examined his reflection in the mirror above the wash basin. The man staring back at him looked different from the field hand who had left the Pierce plantation 3 weeks earlier. The constant tension and careful acting had changed his bearing, made him hold himself differently. His hands, once soft from barn work, were now calloused from his trek through the wilderness. But it was his eyes that showed the greatest change. They held a hardness that hadn't been there before, a wariness born of knowing that any moment could bring discovery and death. He was no longer Noah Carter the slave, but he wasn't yet William Johnson the free man. He was something in between, a fugitive caught in the liminal space between bondage and liberty. Elizabeth proved to be more than just another station master. Over the next 2 days, as Noah waited for the next leg of his journey to be arranged, she became something like a teacher, helping him refine his persona as a free colored man. She taught him how to tip his hat to white strangers without seeming subservient, how to make conversation without revealing too much about his background, how to carry himself with the confidence of someone who owned his spear. Own labor. Freedom isn't just about not being owned, she explained as they walked through the town's market square. It's about knowing how to navigate the world as your own person, how to make decisions and live with the consequences. Noah absorbed these lessons eagerly, understanding that they were as vital to his survival as the forged papers in his pocket. The physical journey north was only half the challenge. The other half was learning how to be free, how to think and act like someone who had never worn chains. On his last night at the boarding house, Elizabeth introduced him to another guest, a free black man named Frederick, who had made the journey from slavery to freedom years earlier, and now worked as a carpenter in Philadelphia. Frederick's story was both inspiring and sobering, a reminder that freedom brought its own challenges and dangers. "Won't lie to you," Frederick said, as they sat by the fire in Elizabeth's parlor. "Life up north isn't easy for our people. There's prejudice and discrimination, jobs that won't hire you because of your color, neighborhoods where you're not welcome. But it's still better than slavery, because at least you have choices, even if they're not good ones." Frederick spoke of the vibrant communities of free black people in cities like Philadelphia and New York, places where former slaves had built churches and schools, businesses and families. He described the constant vigilance required to avoid kidnappers who would sell free black people back into slavery, the need to carry papers at all times and stay alert for dangers that white people never had to consider. "But the best part," Frederick said, his eyes lighting up, "is watching your children grow up knowing they belong to themselves. My boy is 7 now, and when he asks me a question, I don't have to worry about whether my answer might give him dangerous ideas. He's free to dream as big as he wants, free to become whatever he's got the talent and will to be." End quote. The words hit Noah like a physical blow, reminding him of Marcus and the daughter he would never know. His sacrifice had been made in the hope that someday they too might taste freedom, but he was beginning to understand that his escape might be meaningless if they remained in bondage. That realization planted a seed in Noah's mind, an idea that would grow stronger as he continued his journey north. Maybe freedom wasn't something to be enjoyed in isolation, but something to be shared, to be fought for, to be extended to others still trapped in the system he had escaped. The final leg of Noah's journey to the Ohio River took him through Kentucky, where the Underground Railroad operated under constant threat from slave catchers and bounty hunters. His conductor for this stretch was a Quaker farmer named Jeremiah, whose religious convictions had led him to open his home as a sanctuary for fugitive slaves, despite the enormous legal and physical risks involved. Jeremiah was a quiet man who seemed to find God in the everyday work of farming and helping others. His house was filled with the warm bustle of family life, children laughing and playing while their mother tended to the endless tasks of running a household. For Noah, it provided a glimpse of what normal family life could look like for free people, a reminder of what he was ultimately fighting for. "The Lord commands us to help the stranger and the oppressed," Jeremiah explained as he showed Noah to his hiding place in the root cellar beneath the farmhouse. "Can't claim to follow Jesus if I turn my back on folks seeking freedom." The root cellar was cramped and dark, but it was also safe, hidden beneath a false floor that would fool all but the most thorough search. Noah spent 3 days there, listening to the sounds of family life above him and thinking about the choices that had led him to this underground refuge. During those quiet hours, he wrote another letter to Sarah, this one filled with descriptions of the people he had met and the kindnesses he had experienced. He wanted her to know that the world was bigger and more complex than either of them had imagined, that there were people of all colors who believed in justice and were willing to act on those beliefs. On his 4th night at Jeremiah's farm, Noah was awakened by urgent whispers, and the sound of horses approaching. Through the cracks in the floorboards above, he could hear men's voices, rough and demanding, asking questions about runaway slaves and threatening consequences for anyone caught harboring fugitives. "We know you Quakers help runaways," one voice declared, harsh with authority. "Got reports of a dangerous fugitive heading through these parts. Murdered his master down in Georgia. Worth $1,000 to the man who brings him in." Noah's heart pounded as he listened to the search above, boots moving across the floors, furniture being moved, voices growing closer to his hiding place. He gripped his knife, prepared to fight rather than be taken alive, but the false floor held, and the searchers eventually moved on, frustrated by their inability to find evidence of his presence. When they were gone, Jeremiah helped Noah out of the cellar, his face pale but determined. "Time to move you along," he said. "They'll be back. And next time they might bring dogs." The next morning, before dawn, Noah began the final stage of his journey to the Ohio River. His new conductor was a freed slave named Thomas, who had bought his own freedom years earlier and now used his knowledge of the river crossings to help others make the transition from bondage to liberty. The Ohio River represented more than just a geographical boundary. It was the symbolic dividing line between slavery and freedom, the Jordan River of American bondage that thousands had crossed in search of the Promised Land. As Noah stood on its southern bank, looking across the dark water to the lights of Ohio beyond, he felt the weight of history and hope pressing down on him. "Current's tricky this time of year," Thomas warned as they prepared the small boat that would carry Noah across. "But once you reach the other side, you'll be in free territory. Still gotta be careful. There's slave catchers operating up there too, but at least the law will be on your side instead of against you." The crossing itself was anticlimactic, just a few minutes of pulling against the current in a leaky boat. But when Noah's feet touched the Ohio shore, he felt something fundamental change inside him. For the first time in his life, he stood on soil where slavery was illegal, where his status as a human being was recognized by law, if not always by custom. Thomas pointed him toward a safe house in Cincinnati, where he could rest and plan his next moves. "From here on, you're on your own," he said. "But remember, freedom isn't a destination, it's a way of living. Make your choices count." As Noah walked away from the river, carrying nothing but his forged papers and the clothes on his back, he thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. He had traveled hundreds of miles through dangerous territory, relied on the kindness of strangers, and risked his life countless times for the chance to stand where he stood now. But he also understood that his journey was far from over. Freedom brought new responsibilities, new challenges, new choices about how to live and what to fight for. The story of Noah Carter the slave was ending, but the story of William Johnson the free man was just beginning, and that story would be shaped by how he chose to use the liberty he had claimed at such great cost.